Today I'm going to talk about the difference between simultaneous and sequential lineups. I will discuss what they are and how they can be used to improve eyewitness identification. To do this, I'll be using the research done by Lindsay and Wells from 1985, and it's titled Improving Eyewitness Identifications from Lineups, Simultaneous versus Sequential Lineup Presentation. To begin with, I thought it would be best to explain the difference between the two different kinds of lineups. The definition of a simultaneous lineup is where witnesses must use relative judgment to compare lineup pictures or members to each other. Relative judgment is where you would pick someone who most resembles the actual perpetrator, even if the perp isn't pictured. So, as I've shown with the pictures below, a simultaneous lineup would look something like the group of pictures on the right. So all these pictures will be shown at the same time. They'll all be on like one piece of paper or something like that, and you'll be able to see all 6 or 8 pictures at the same time. For a sequential lineup, witnesses must use absolute judgment by comparing each picture or person only to the memory of what the offender looked like. So again, I've shown a picture of what a sequential lineup may look like. A witness would be shown all 6 pictures just like the witness would be from a simultaneous lineup, but they are only shown one at a time. So you'll get one picture, you'll make the decision, you'll get the next picture, you'll make the decision, and so on, instead of all at once like the simultaneous lineup is. I also thought that I should introduce some other information that I thought would be necessary for you guys to better understand the article. This article talks a lot about identification accuracy and false identifications. False identifications of innocent people have been obtained from as few as 12% or as many as 78% in many different stage crime experiments. These percents go to show how reliable witness identification actually is. The article also uses the words foils and distractors, and those are basically just like the stand-ins. They are there in the pictures, but they have nothing to do with the crime. They're just people who are there to be identified maybe as a suspect or maybe not. They usually have nothing to do with the crime. Finally, thought it would be best to know that sometimes these lineups do have the perpetrator in them, but sometimes they don't, just to kind of see what the eyewitness actually saw. But if a lineup does contain the perpetrator, the eyewitness can make an accurate identification, which is where they would choose the right person who actually committed the crime. They can also make a foil identification, which is a false identification, where they would have picked the wrong person or like one of the foils out of the lineup. Or a correct no identification, which is where they said that the perpetrator wasn't pictured and they were correct about it. Also, identifications of the suspect and no identifications may be either accurate or inaccurate depending on whether the lineup actually contains the perpetrator or not. Okay, so for this article, the basic research question was which form of lineup, sequential lineup or the simultaneous lineup, will result in fewer false identifications and more no identifications. So basically they're trying to figure out which style of lineup would be more accurate in eyewitness identifications. The hypothesis for this experiment was that the sequential lineup presentation would inhibit the use of relative judgment and result in fewer false identifications and more no identifications. Also, the researchers thought the sequential lineup procedure would yield greater diagnosticity ratios than does the common simultaneous lineup procedure. So pretty much the researchers thought that the sequential lineup procedure would make it to where the eyewitnesses would not use the relative judgment to identify the perpetrator. And like I said before, the relative judgment is where you would pick someone who most looks like the actual perpetrator, even if they aren't pictured. Therefore, this would result in fewer false identifications and more no identifications. So who was involved in this case study? Well, the participants were 243 Queen's University psychology students, and 1 to 4 students would partake in each of the sessions. So for this experiment, the experimenter met the participants in the laboratory, and then they led them to like a cubicle that contained some tables and chairs. The cubicle had a counter at like waist level, And on 2 walls there were drawers and cupboards below the counter and cupboards above the counter. After the participants had been seated, the experimenter explained that she had to leave briefly to get some forms, and she closed her door on the way out. About 30 seconds after the experimenter left, a 21-year-old Caucasian male walked into the cubicle. He looked directly at the participants and stated that he didn't know that anyone was in the room and that he would be out of the way in just a moment. He searched through several drawers and cupboards along both of the walls, and he finally found a calculator that was in a leather case. With the calculator in his hand, he walked to the door and looked at all of the participants one last time, and then closed the door behind him. The entire event lasted only about 20 seconds. The experimenter returned shortly after the man had left and explained that the thief was a Confederate and that the students had just witnessed a staged crime. All of the participants were told that the true purpose of the experiment was to investigate eyewitness identification accuracy. The participants were then asked to complete an open-ended description of the criminal. Then they were asked to fill out a detailed questionnaire about his appearance. About 5 minutes after the viewing of the crime, the eyewitnesses were asked to attempt to identify the criminal in some of the pictures. In this experiment, they used 2 different identification procedures. The first half, the eyewitnesses were given the simultaneous presentation of the lineups. They were shown a board that had 6 pictures of all the same size and numbered 1 through 6, and that would look similar to the picture that I have on the slide. It'd be like they have just straight pictures of them. They're all about the same size and numbered 1 through 8 through 6, depending on whatever. And all of these pictures included Caucasian males in their early 20s. For the first half of the participants, so 60, the perpetrator was actually one of the men that was pictured. But for the other half, the other 60, just a man who resembled him took his place. The eyewitnesses were given a form that had the numbers 1 through 6 on them, and then a box that said none of them. At the bottom of the form, there was they were to rate on a scale of 1 to 7 how certain they were that their identification of the man was correct. Before they were shown the picture, the experimenter made the statement, "Remember, as in a real identification situation, the guilty party may or may not be present." The participants were then given 3 to 5 minutes to complete the identification form. The second half of the eyewitnesses were given the sequential presentation form of the lineups, and they were asked a completely different identification form. This form had the same statement, which is, "Remember, as in a real identification situation, the guilty party may or may not be present." The next line read, "Is number 1 the person you saw? No or yes?" and was followed by a 7-point certainty scale, just like in the first form. The experimenter explained that the eyewitness would be shown a sequence of individual pictures and must decide whether or not it was the picture of the criminal. The experimenter held in her hand a deck of 12 pictures, and they were face down. She asked, "Is number 1 the person you saw?" And she flipped over the first picture and waited for the witness to circle either yes or no, and then a second number indicating how certain they were of their decision. Then the experimenter repeated the procedure. After the 6th picture, the experimenter said that there would be no more pictures. The witnesses were intentionally led to believe that there may be more than 6 pictures to reduce the tendency to increase the probability of making a yes response at the end of the approach. I thought this was really clever, in my opinion, because I never would have taken someone, like a person saying yes at the end of the pile. Like, if it's coming close to the end of the pile, some person may feel like they need to say yes, and I never would have taken that into consideration. Anyway, half of the sequential lineup witnesses were shown 6 pictures, including where it was including the perpetrator, and the other half were shown a photo of a man that just resembled him. So, the results. This was the chart that was in the article, so I'm just going to explain it kind of briefly. So, when the perpetrator was present in the simultaneous lineup, 0.58 identified the suspect, 0.12 identified the foil, or someone that was a fill-in, and 0.3 made no identification. They said that the perpetrator was not present. In the sequential lineups, 0.50 identified the suspect, so the person who actually did it. 0.02 identified the foil, and 0.48 made a no identification. When the perpetrator was absent, for the stimulus lineup, 0.43 identified the suspect, which was the person that they put in to resemble the man who was the actual perpetrator. 0.15 identified the foil, so just one of the other felons, and 0.42 made no identification. They said he wasn't present. In the sequential lineup, 0.17 identified the suspect, 0.18 identified the foil, and 0.65 made a no identification. They said the perp was not present. As expected, the suspect was significantly more likely to be identified when guilty rather than innocent. The suspect was also significantly more likely to be identified using the simultaneous lineups compared to the sequential lineup procedure. As a result, the simultaneous lineup presentation produced a much lower diagnosticity rate than did the sequential lineup presentations. The total number of incorrect identifications of the innocent people may be of interest because police don't always restrict the lineups to just a single suspect. Overall, though, 35% of the eyewitnesses exposed to the simultaneous lineup identified an innocent person, whereas only 18.3% of the eyewitnesses shown the same lineups, just sequentially, so individually, identified innocent people. Those two percentages are completely different, showing that a sequential lineup obviously had better outcomes. People were more likely to pick the right person rather than identify someone who was completely innocent. For the confidence part of the experiment, eyewitnesses who identified the guilty party were slightly more confident than those who identified the innocent suspect. This resulted in a small, significant confidence accuracy correlation there. Similarly, eyewitnesses making a correct no identification decision were slightly more confident than those making an incorrect no identification decision. Again, this resulted in a slight significant confidence accuracy correlation. So, with all of these results being stated, the hypothesis they originally had was correct. A sequential lineup procedure yields greater diagnosticity ratios than does the common simultaneous lineup procedure. With this data, it shows that using the sequential lineup procedure results in more correct identifications and less false identifications. Overall, I thought this was a pretty good experiment. I actually had learned about the difference between these two lineup strategies in a different psychology class that I'm taking, and I personally found it very interesting, which kind of sparked my interest to do this specific article. My only question or confusion, I guess, is that if it's proven to be more accurate to use the sequential lineups, then why do police forces still use the simultaneous presentations? I really truly don't know the answer to this question. I mean, if it's proven to be more accurate, I don't understand why they wouldn't take that into consideration, but more studies probably need to be done before things make a change. But this article was a great thing to read, and the experiment itself was a pretty good study. I thought it very clearly illustrated the difference between the simultaneous lineups and the sequential lineup procedures, and I think that the study overall was pretty interesting.